In this fourth Sunday of Lent, our theme today is In the Wilderness We Connect. In the wilderness we connect. Lord, I just pray in this moment that you will guide our listening, you will guide how we receive these words, we will guide that we trust that in your words we will have new life and we will understand ways in which we are supposed to live. Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our collective hearts will be acceptable in your sight at all times. Amen. So far this Lent, we have been stripped bare in a barren wilderness. Our minds are struggling, our bodies are restless, our spirits are concerned. In some way, shape, or form, we have found ourselves separated from God. But Lent is a season of transformation. And in order for transformation to happen, we have to be patient and spend some time wandering in the wilderness. Eventually, as we wander, we have to surrender to our experience. We have to cut ourselves from the attachments that we cling to, like who we picture ourselves to be, where we thought we would be in this season of life, how we might be repeatedly asking why something is happening to us. Eventually, somehow, in some way, we have to let all of that go. We have to surrender to it, and we have to give it over to God. But it is at this point, when we're finally able to let it go, that the transformation process in the wilderness actually begins. As we spoke about last week, after we surrender, the first things we need to do is we need to look for God. We need to open up our eyes and look for the presence of God all around us. Look for God everywhere, beyond just ourselves, but in the world in which we live. Our God, as we said, is uncontainable. God is not just here in the church. God is in all, at all times. Everything created by God bears God. Now, just to be clear, it's not that the things are God, it's that God is within all things. See, we live in a majestic, sacred cathedral, and when we begin to look for God, God shows up. We see God everywhere when we start to look for God. Back in 2016, Bianca and I bought a new car. We haven't done it in a while. We were living in New York City, so we didn't really need one. However, now we did, and we bought a car that I had never really heard of. We bought a car that the brand was kind of innocuous. I hadn't seen around the city too much. It was a 2012 Hunter Green Hyundai Santa Fe. Not a Honda, a Hyundai. And as I said, I'd never really seen this particular kind of car. I knew Hyundai, but I'd only seen a few around the city. But a magical thing happened. We bought this car, and suddenly everybody in New York City owned it. We drive around, I'm like, there's a Hyundai Santa Fe. Hey, there's our car. There's our car again. And it was everywhere. When we begin to look for God, we begin to see God everywhere. It's an intentional looking for God that makes the difference. And when we realize God is everywhere, what a beautiful world we live in. How different is it to walk in a world where God's presence is in all things, where God's presence is around us, and we can actually sense and see and feel God's presence in this sacred cathedral in which we walk. In fact, the Catholic Order of Franciscans, those who Francis of Assisi began, they have a belief that's a beautiful belief that creation was actually the first Bible. They said that the world was formed 4.5 billion years ago. Our Bible was written a couple of thousand years ago. So before our Bible existed, what existed? It was God's creation. And God's creation serves as the first holy text. And within this holy text, within the natural world, God's creation, everything in the Bible we can see in the natural world. It's a beautiful understanding of the world in which we live, and it leads me to today's theme. That as God has brought us into the wilderness, we are being transformed. We have surrendered and we are seeing God, and this opens us up to making new connections. Seeing divinity everywhere opens our souls to new heart connections and new lessons and new experiences. And we start the process of building ourselves back up. As we've let ourselves go and released our attachments, this is where the building back up starts to begin. And so I want to take a moment to talk about real quickly the difference between attachment and connection, because this came up in our Lenten study last week. What is the difference between attachment and connection? Because remember I brought up the understanding that attachment is the root of all suffering, as the Buddhists like to teach. Our attachments are how we suffer. And so, as I can articulate the difference, attachment comes from our mind and through our thoughts. It is a need-based thing. Attachment is need-based, and as one person put it, it's selfish. It comes out of our need of something from ourselves. It comes from trying to fill a void inside. Attachment is either about the past, how good it used to be, or about a connection we used to have and we're longing for that to return, or it's about the future, our expectations or ideas about how something should be or how something should happen. Attachment, for those of us who are a certain age, attachment is Al Bundy constantly reliving and longing for his high school football days, even though he's now a 50-year-old something shoe salesman. Attachment is making sure something operates the way it did 50 years ago, because that's just the way we do it. Attachment is the devotion to the expectation that by the time I'm 40, I will be married with 2 kids making a certain amount of money. There's nothing wrong with goals, but when we build an attachment around these goals, then it's something else. This is attachment. Now, connection, on the other hand, is something different. Connection comes from and through the heart. In a way, it's hard to describe connection because connection is our soul essence connecting with another soul essence. Our souls are bonding in connection. And connection is freedom. It has no strings. It has no expectations. Connection just is. You know it when you experience it. It's the enjoyment of the other. It's resonance with another being. Connection is having a soulmate or a partner, but not expecting that partner to fit in any sort of box. It's being connected to your partner or your love and enjoying the journey that you're on with them. You're not expecting them to move in any sort of way. You enjoy watching them move in the way in which they move. I heard someone say that connection is that feeling you have with those special people in your life where you feel you are safe to be who you are. You feel seen and you feel heard and you feel comfortable because you know that no matter what, they are still going to love you. Connection is deeply spiritual. Connection is deep in our souls. And so on our journey of transformation, when we begin seeing God throughout this sacred cathedral, we begin to open ourselves to new and divine connection. And our focus during this Lenten season is on what Jesus might have experienced in the wilderness before the tests and the temptations. As Jesus is alone in the wilderness, what might he have experienced? But the thing is, Jesus was not alone. Jesus was not by himself. Jesus was surrounded by natural life. Plants, trees, animals. In the words of Francis of Assisi, he could see brother sun and sister moon. He could feel the rocks and the sands on his feet. There's so much in the wilderness that Jesus could connect to. And so now I can hear some of the backlash coming into what I just said, saying, Stephen, what kind of New Age tree-hugging snowflake theology are you coming up with here? Somewhere along the way, we as a Western society have divorced ourselves from the natural world. We've stopped witnessing the sacred natural cathedral in which we live. Unfortunately, technology has brought us out of the natural world in many ways. And now, being able to be attached to the natural world is seen at best as weak, soft, overly sensitive, or weird. It's weird to speak to a tree like our indigenous siblings did and still do. And at worst, listening to and learning from the natural world is deemed anti-Christian, is deemed as nature worship, is deemed as being witchcraft and pagan, when in reality, it is very, very biblical. Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature have been understood and seen through the things God has made. Revelations 5:13, then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea singing, giving honor and glory and might to God. Psalm 104 goes through a whole list of creation and their experiences in the world, then says, when you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Luke 19, which we'll be reading in a couple of weeks, speaking on Palm Sunday, the Pharisees, as Jesus enters into Jerusalem, the Pharisees try to get Jesus to quiet his followers who are praising God and worshiping God joyfully. And Jesus says, I tell you, if they were silent, even the stones would shout out. I can go on and on, but I think you get the point. When we wander in the wilderness unsettled, and we're able to let go and look for God, we open ourselves to a divine connection with not just other people, but God's divine creation. And God's creation will teach us if we allow it to. Look at the scripture reading this morning. In a rebuttal to his friend Zophar said that Job's suffering was due to something with his sinfulness, that Job brought on his suffering himself because of his actions and his sinful nature. Job rebukes this. And in his rebuke, he speaks of how God's created world testifies to God's sovereignty. Job says the natural world will testify and teach us. Job says, ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea will declare to you. The natural world will teach us if we open ourselves to that connection. I like to think, as Jesus was coming to terms with his newly understood identity as the Son of God, remember, he entered the wilderness after being baptized, and all of a sudden hearing the voice of God saying, you are my Son, with whom I am well pleased. I talked about how that must have made Jesus so bewildered, having just heard the voice of God for maybe the first time, and his identity being claimed in maybe a new way, that Jesus had to come to terms with this. And that's the wisdom of God and the Spirit of God who took Jesus into the wilderness for a 40-day period. And during this 40-day period, Jesus learned to give up, to surrender over to God. And then allowed God and the Spirit to teach him and build him up. And he began to see God in a new way and allow the wilderness to hold him and to teach him and to see the world in different ways, in the new ways. And through the new divine connection with the world around him, it gave him the strength and the wisdom and the courage to be able, when the tempter came, to detract what he was saying, to not give in to the tests and the temptations that the great tempter offered Jesus, which were very tempting to anybody. How would Jesus be able to resist this? It was through him being built up with the Spirit and God teaching him through all different ways, through the connections that he made in the wilderness. I think Jesus opened himself up to be taught and make connections with the natural world. And so how do we do this? How do we allow ourselves to connect with the natural world in a world that is often divorced from our natural cathedral. About 2 years ago, I went to go spend some time in a men's retreat out in New Mexico. And it was a week-long process that we did a whole bunch of different things. But the very last teaching that we had on the very last day said, they said, your task today is to go find a place. We were in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. Go find a place in the mountains. Go find a place in the wilderness. Go find a place where you're by yourself. You can't take your phone. You can't take anything to read. You can take a notebook to write. That's it. And when you find a place that is calling to you, I want you to imagine there's a 10-foot diameter circle, and you can't go anywhere outside of those 10 feet. And you're supposed to sit there for the next 5 hours. And by the way, you can't take a watch. We want you to have faith that you're going to know when to come back. It was a force for us. It forced us to connect with the world in a way that we weren't used to, and it made us uncomfortable. They said, if something comes in your circle, just imagine it was meant to come into your circle. We were forced to look at the world in a different way. We were forced to we entered that circle unsettled. Like, am I going to be able to do this? Will I be able to sit here for 5 hours? Will I be able to do all these things that they're wanting us to do? Will I be able to know what I'm supposed to be getting out of this? Our minds just ran and ran. My mind just ran and ran and ran and ran. But eventually, as the time went on, my spirit started to settle. And suddenly, the 10-foot circle started to become a new home. Suddenly, I started to see the animals, the little insects in my 10-foot circle. I just began to watch and observe them. I began to notice the clouds and see the skies, which I hadn't done in a long time. I started to settle in to this place that I called my temporary home. And it allowed me to take in the world in a different way and connect to a different way. And that place still, when someone says go to a place where you feel the most comfortable, that place is now the place that I imagine, because it became something different than just a little grassy knoll on a mountainside. It became something that spoke to my spirit. And so when we ask, how are we supposed to connect to not just human beings, although this advice is apropos for human beings, but how are we supposed to connect with the world around us? And the first thing is we need to be intentional and spend time in the natural world, whether that is taking our shoes off and walking in our lawn, to make sure we do that on a regular basis, or whether it's going to a preserve and spending some time in a natural preserve. Whatever it looks like for you, it'll be unique to each and every one of us. We have to be intentional. And we have to spend time without our phones. Spend time without the technology that diverts our attention all the time. And then when we get there, we then have to open our hearts. We have to be able to be willing to say, teach me. Or what do you have for me today? Or God, allow me to walk in a new way as I spend this time with you. And then it's important for us to then be quiet and to listen and to look. Imagine seeing God in all the natural world that we see around us. Because God will show up, because God is present. But it requires us to be intentional. It requires us to consent to God's activity inside of us and all around us. And it requires us to be quiet, to listen, and to look for the presence of God, look for the messages being sent. See, our purpose is not to be alone in this world. The purpose of the wilderness is not a place where we're supposed to stay for long periods of time. The purpose of the wilderness is for us to be transformed, for us to know what it means to be in the wilderness, so that as when we emerge, we can then help others who are walking through that wilderness. It's a place for us to gather more empathy for those around us and the world around us. The wilderness offers us an intentional space to reconnect with God and the world around us. And if we just allow ourselves, even surrender to this connection, to these connections, then God is going to build us up and teach us in ways we would never have imagined, and lessons that we might not even understand at the time, but will feed us throughout time as we walk in our relationship with God. The wilderness is a place where we are transformed, and it comes through seeing God and feeling that connection with everything around us. And it builds us up and it changes us. And so I invite you, as you go throughout the world this week, look for God, but also seek connections with the world in ways that you haven't done so before. Amen.